85 million. That is nearly the population of Turkey. That is more than the population of the UK and more than the population of France, Germany, and many other countries of the world. But that is also the population of the people with disabilities in China. 257 million. If combined, they could form their own country and it would be the fifth largest country in the world. And that is the population of the elderly in China. With such demographics, of course, accessibility becomes a huge question. And to talk about this question of accessibility, I have with me Martha Issacs. Martha is an urban planner from the US and she's currently researching accessibility in China. Martha, tell me a little bit about your research and what have you discovered so far in this journey of understanding China and how accessible it is?
Yes, so as Pallavi said, I'm an urban planner from the US, and I was previously working in New York City to improve streets and sidewalks for safety, so making sure that streets and sidewalks are safe for pedestrians and cyclists, particularly vulnerable populations, so children, elderly pedestrians, people with disabilities. In the US, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, so whenever I would do a project, it was required that we make accessibility improvements. That could mean a variety of things. When you're talking about accessibility for wheelchair users, it's ensuring that the sidewalk is wide enough, it's ensuring that there's pedestrian ramps, so someone in a wheelchair can get on and off the sidewalk. We're talking about accessibility for people with vision disabilities, it's ensuring that there's accessible pedestrian signals, so when someone's crossing the street, they can hear when it's safe to cross. So I was interested in coming to China to look into what accessibility in street design looks like here for a few reasons. A, as you mentioned, China has a rapidly aging population. There is this perception that there's not that many people with disabilities, but as you said, there are millions and millions, and almost everyone is impacted by a disability at some point in their lifetime when they're injured or as they age. So my mother was able-bodied previously, but now she has bad arthritis and has difficulty walking. And accessibility in the built environment is really crucial for everyone, for mothers and fathers pushing strollers, for people pushing luggage. Just being able to move through a space smoothly is really important for everyone.
Especially if you get injured at any point in your life and then you realize that how important it actually is.
Exactly. And as I said, accessibility is multifaceted. It's important to have accessibility for people with physical disabilities, vision disabilities, cognitive disabilities. My younger sibling has autism, so has difficulty navigating through a city or being independent in that way. But for my research in China, I focused specifically on physical accessibility because that is an issue that is very apparent. Just when you're walking around Tsinghua University or around Beijing, you can see that many of the sidewalks have trees in the middle of them, or they have bikes parked on the sidewalk. So it's clear that it's very difficult to be a wheelchair user in Beijing. So I'm researching why that is, and if China is considering the aging population and the population with disabilities when planning new cities. Because unlike some other places, like the US, for example, China is actively building new cities and even new areas in Beijing. Like in Beijing, I'm doing research on Tongzhou, which is a new satellite neighborhood to the east of Beijing. So it's an opportunity to build an accessible environment from the ground up. Rather than retrofitting an old street or sidewalk, you can make one accessible from the ground up. So my research has been looking into, is that happening? Why or why not? And how are the new laws in China shaping that process?
But China, if you talk about it from the legal perspective, had its first law about accessibility back in the 1990s. And from there till, like, say, 2023, where they had the recent law about barrier-free environment, there has been like a legal framework that exists in China, which didn't exist in many countries and still doesn't exist in many countries of the world. So despite that support structure there of the legal framework, what do you think are the major challenges why China is not as accessible as it should be?
As you said, there is sort of a growing body of laws in China about accessibility. Many of the disability researchers and activists I speak to really bring up 2008, when Beijing hosted the 2008 Olympics. That really encouraged a lot of infrastructure development in Beijing in terms of new subway lines, new streets and sidewalks, including accessibility improvements, because along with the Olympics are the Paralympics. Also in 2012 was the first regulation on barrier-free design. So yeah, in Chinese, the word is 无障碍, barrier-free. But that was just a regulation, so it wasn't really a binding law. And then in Beijing, in 2019 to 2021, there was sort of a barrier-free action plan with various projects trying to improve accessibility. And then, as you mentioned, really big milestone for China in 2023, there was the law on the construction of barrier-free environments. So a lot of people are very excited about this right now because, again, this is the first law mandating accessible construction. There's many issues with this in terms of the actual implementation. This law comes from the national level, but like many policies in China, different municipalities and local governments can apply it as they see fit. So there's not a lot of oversight about exactly how the law is implemented. Also, the law didn't really come with specific design guidelines. So there's existing street design guidelines in China, some of them lack specificity and also lack clarity on how different agencies should work together. For example, in China, often the street is owned by the Department of Transportation, the trees are owned by the Department of Green Space or Parks and Recreation or whatever you'd want to call it. The drains and the catch basins are owned by environmental protection or whoever works on the stormwater. So it can be difficult to have a comprehensive change to the street because it requires a lot of coordination between the different agencies. So although the law is advocating for accessible design, it doesn't really explain what agencies should be responsible for this. So there's sort of like a lack of implementation.
An outsider's perspective about China is that because all the land is owned by the government, then it's easy to make infrastructure, it's easy to make changes in an infrastructure, and it is much more easier to make things accessible as compared to other countries. But you're telling me, like on the ground, it's much more complex, and it's as complex as it could be anywhere else.
Yes, I would say I was also surprised by that. Coming from the US perspective, I thought, it must be so easy to be an urban planner in China because there's central government control. There's a lot of the same bureaucratic issues that you would face in other countries. Another issue is that cities and local government leaders are facing so many key performance indicator requirements and so many sort of suggestions from the national government. To be a sponge city, that is a city that captures stormwater, or a green city, or a city that's good for children, or an economically vibrant city, or an industrial vibrant city. There's many different asks from the government, and accessibility is just one of those. And accessibility is comparatively a difficult metric to achieve, especially when you're talking about ripping up old streets and sidewalks. So even though there is this new law, there's not a lot of enforcement or oversight or sort of specificity about how to achieve this. And when talking to urban planners about new areas like Tongzhou, the new neighborhood in Beijing, I asked them about when they were forming the master plan for that neighborhood, from the bottom up, forming the master plan, what is the goal of this neighborhood? Accessibility was only mentioned once or twice. The main goals were reducing congestion in Beijing, making a green city, but accessibility really seemed to be an afterthought. And when I visited this new area, I would say it is more accessible than your typical old street in Beijing. The sidewalks are wider. There's bike parking on the side of the sidewalk so it doesn't block the sidewalk. There are more pedestrian ramps. There are more accessible pedestrian signals, but there's still complete gaps in the network where you don't have a pedestrian ramp or a pedestrian ramp is poorly constructed. And I asked the urban planner that I interviewed about that, and she said sometimes there's a disconnect between the initial scheme and the actual implementation. So the construction workers actually doing the construction or the construction drawings are missing some of the accessibility details, and also it's not checked afterwards. So in New York, whenever we upgrade a pedestrian ramp, they're actually investigated afterwards to make sure that it's compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that means making that the slope isn't too steep, because sometimes around China you see a ramp that exists, but the slope is way too steep, so it's not actually usable for someone in a wheelchair. Or the ramp exists, but there's a big divot, so someone would, not be able to get onto the ramp. So in these kinds of things, you really need to have quality control. So that's sort of missing as of now. And that is changing. I would say that Tsinghua has an Institute for Accessibility, and the importance of this is rising, but they're just not there yet in terms of reforming the way that these systems are operated to prioritize accessibility more.
As you mentioned, there are spaces that are mentioned as accessible or created as accessible, but in reality, they're not that accessible. One of the spaces would be many of the tourist sites, which say that they're wheelchair friendly, but when you actually visit the space, it's not really wheelchair friendly. So there's also a question of, especially in cases of those sites where maybe it's a historical site that is protected and archaeologically it has to be like maintained in a certain way, you try to make it wheelchair friendly, you try to make it accessible, but there's also the balance of like not trying to harm the structure too much. So how do you think about that? Is that a question that is being deliberated upon, like how to make many of these spaces which are historically important accessible without like doing much damage to them?
Yeah, I would say this is a huge question. This is at the confluence of urban planning and also historic preservation, and something that comes up in a city like Beijing with many different cultural heritage sites. But I would argue that it's crucial for these heritage sites to be usable by everyone. And there's some pretty simple ways that you can make a temple, for example, accessible. Temples usually have sort of an entryway with a barrier that's part of the traditional design. But it's pretty easy to add a modular ramp so someone in a wheelchair can get up onto them. And in places like the Great Wall, for example, there are certain areas which are wheelchair accessible. They didn't make the entire thing accessible, but making certain areas, restoring them, adding ramps. I mean, it is a very, very difficult question because adding infrastructure like elevators, for example, is extremely expensive. And I would say that tourist sites should be accessible, but at the very least, we have to make sure housing, hospital, jobs, schools, streets are accessible. I mean, tourist sites as well, but with limited funding, with limited political prioritization, I think that should be considered, but it shouldn't be the number one priority. But it's also very important. It's just difficult because you're often working with older materials. You need to match the aesthetics. For example, in New York City, all of our pedestrian ramps are red. They're high contrast, so that they're also visible for someone with a vision disability that maybe has some vision, that they're higher contrast, so they're more visible. But in historic areas, the red stands out more. It doesn't blend in with the natural character. So in those historic areas, we use a white color. So there are ways to sort of make accessibility improvements, but also blend in with the local character. And I would argue that other considerations have this much priority, you know, like, oh, landscape architecture, where should we put the plants, where should we put the chairs, fitting into historic character. But we just need to have the same level of detail and same level of care for accessibility because it is a human rights issue. You know, everyone deserves to be able to move through their city, access jobs, schools, education. And there's also co-benefits. If people are able to move through a city freely, they can access jobs and therefore contribute to the economy. And there's also an environmental benefit because if people don't need to rely on cars as much because they can roll themselves from destination to destination, it saves emissions in that way. So it really offers several benefits and it just should be prioritized more in historic preservation as well.
From cars comes a question of public transport, and what have you observed so far? Do you think the public transport in China is accessible? And if so, what are still the challenges that need to be overcome?
Yes, I mean, coming from New York City, where less than 30% of the subway stations are accessible, I would say Beijing is much better in that way. You know, many stations have elevators, but unfortunately, there are still issues with accessing the station. I've seen many examples of there being an elevator present, but there are bikes blocking the entrance, or there's no ramp to get to the entrance to the station. So you can't really think about public transit as separate from the street network. It has to be a comprehensive accessibility planning process. And the accessibility improvements I have seen, you know, in Tongzhou, in a new area, or at a temple, or at a park, they're not really part of a larger Beijing master plan for accessibility. And that's what you really have to think about, the route planning. And New York has this exact same issue. You know, when we add an elevator, ensuring that you can actually reach the elevator is really crucial. And I have to say that I don't typically see many wheelchair users on the subway, as I do in New York. And there have been some viral videos, I don't know if you have seen these, people with vision disabilities trying to bring their service dogs onto public transport, like onto buses, for example, and them being, you know, booed or pushed away, even though it's technically legal, just there being more of a stigma around having a service dog. And service dogs are extremely expensive. They usually cost around 70,000 USD to train. So very few people in the world actually have access to them. That's why it is exciting to consider things like AI potentially, because we have so much more data now because of autonomous vehicles about the way the street is, that hopefully we could also use that data to get more information about how the sidewalk is, so that someone in a wheelchair knows the most accessible route to travel, or someone with a vision disability knows how to avoid that tree or avoid the bench in the street. So I think it is an exciting time. Yeah.
There has to be like a distinction that needs to be drawn between the legal side as well as the norms. And for any country, the norms are essentially shaped by the culture of the place. Right now, when you're in China and you interact with people, what do you see? Do people have the kind of exposure about people with disabilities, and are they aware of the sensibilities, aware of the different nuances that they need to take care of to be able to be more accommodative of these issues of accessibility? Like booing somebody off the bus just for using a guide dog, that seems like extremely insensitive. But do you think like it's more about like the lack of awareness in people about people with disabilities?
Yeah, well, I have to say I'm coming from an American perspective, and I'm able-bodied myself. But I would say that there's a stigma everywhere in the world about having a disability, including in the US, including in China. I would say that my advisor here at Tsinghua University, his daughter has autism, and heard that my sibling had autism. So we talked a lot about that and the stigma in China about, oh, you know, why aren't you acting normal? Why can't you get a job? Why can't you get a wife? But that exact same stigma exists in the US. In terms of physical disabilities, one thing I've noticed here is that strangers are more willing to help people in wheelchairs. You know, if a store or a shop doesn't have a ramp to access it, I've seen strangers helping people in a wheelchair get up onto the ramp, and I really haven't seen that as much in the US. Maybe more of a culture of reaching out and caring for others, like this sort of community perspective. But I think, yeah, education and norms is just as, if not more important than design. I focus more on the design and physical environment side because that's what I have the ability to change. That's what my background is in. But you can design something a certain way, and if people don't choose to use it correctly, it's rendered useless. You know, even if you make a bike lane, if people park in the bike lane, the bikers can't use it. Even on Tsinghua's campus, we have only, I think, 3 canteens that are accessible. But at one of the canteens where there's a ramp to enter it, people often park their bike there. So then the accessible design is rendered useless. So it's very important to have education and awareness alongside physical environment changes, just so people are aware of how many people do need to access these areas, why it is important. And I think something I hear a lot in China is, oh, well, I don't really see people with disabilities on the street, so there must not be that many of them. Like, we don't need to design for them. But that's the very problem, is that people can't go outside or don't feel empowered to walk along the street because it's not designed for them. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of issues worldwide, and that's not even talking about mental health, different like cognitive disabilities, which I think there still is a big stigma worldwide and in China.
Even if you make accessible cities, even then there is a question of being able to navigate, which is also quite a challenge. If you look at maps, and Google Maps don't really work well in China, but like other kinds of maps that exist, do you think that there is that framework in place in which people, if there are accessible routes, people are able to find those accessible routes and are able to understand which way they're supposed to be going?
Yes, I think this is a very important question, and it's something that is growing. In the US, Google Maps has added a feature in some cities for wheelchair accessible routes. In China, there's a few different mapping apps. Gaode does have information about which subway stations have accessibility information. Also, I have seen crowdsourced examples of this, like on Xiaohongshu or various social media sites, people posting where the accessible entrances are in a tourist site. There's also various crowdsourced accessibility maps that I've seen that researchers have created in Beijing, but I do think it needs to be more comprehensive and more robust. As I mentioned earlier, I think that AI and computer vision could be really useful in this. You know, in my work previously, I would use aerial imagery to map where the street is, the width of the street, but that sort of data is becoming more and more detailed with autonomous vehicles. So you have cars driving all over cities with LiDAR technology that bumps off something in order to make a map, a physical model of where it is. And of course now for autonomous vehicles, it's mainly focused on the street. But if we can expand that and also focus on the sidewalk, how wide are the sidewalks, where are the pedestrian ramps, where are the barriers in the sidewalk, that can empower people to actually navigate better, and can also help clarify priorities for urban planners. In New York City, we have a pedestrian map, which shows the entire city and the width of the sidewalk in every area, and also areas that are missing sidewalks. We also have a ranking system for all the pedestrian ramps, again, the ramps where someone in a wheelchair can get onto the sidewalk, where they are inadequate and where they are adequate or, completely accessible. So that sort of database is really useful for making decisions about where should we prioritize our work. Obviously, we want all the streets and all the sidewalks to be accessible in the city, but it's a long process. It takes time and money and construction and political will. So gathering that kind of data is useful for navigating as well as urban planners. So yes, I hope in the future, with better AI and computer vision, someone in a wheelchair could easily map their route, because it might show it's only a 5-minute walk to get somewhere, but then you get there and there's a pedestrian overpass, which is very common across China. It doesn't have an elevator, so you really cannot cross the street, and then adds another 30 minutes because you have to go a completely different way. So I think that's really important. But I do know people at Tsinghua are working on this and actively talking about this, so I'm optimistic for the future.
One of the key features of China, which I think everybody who knows China very little still knows, is that there are cameras everywhere on every street. So do you think some of the challenges that you pointed out, one being there are areas which are accessible but they are blocked by bikes or they're blocked by other objects? Second, there are laws in place, but the implementation is not that well. And third, will that is required to maybe use AI, maybe collect that data and create more accessibility. If the government decides just to be able to use the existing infrastructure and start implementing these laws, accessibility should not be that big an issue in China. There's just this lack of will to actually act on it and try to navigate ways, because the cameras are there, the surveillance is there, AI is there. There are just ways to make it work.
Yes, I would say it still is a big issue just in terms of the scale. To really make every street, sidewalk, hospital, school, building accessible is a massive, massive task in terms of design, in terms of construction, in terms of maintenance. So it is no small feat. I think that's why, as I said earlier, Chinese cities are maybe focusing on other things, like being a green city or an economically vibrant city, because accessibility is difficult. It takes a lot of community outreach, making sure people with disabilities are included in the planning process. But I agree that a lot of the tools are there. In regards to using the cameras and thinking about bikes on the sidewalk, I know that when dockless bike share, which are the bikes that can just be left everywhere, first started in China, it was a lot worse. But then they started geofencing, which only allows you to park your bikes in certain areas. I think that is great, and they really need to continue making sure that bikes are parked not in the middle of the sidewalk. If anything, I think the bike should be parked in the street, creating bike parking areas in the street, taking away space for cars rather than taking away space for pedestrians, for equity reasons as well as environmental reasons. Obviously, we want to make it easier for people to walk rather than to drive. But yeah, I think that the future is bright, I hope. It's an exciting time to be discussing this because of the 2023 law. I just hope that there continues to be political will to actually fund accessibility improvements, prioritize them, and make sure that all urban planners and architects know about including accessibility in their designs. So I hope it will continue in the future, and I really hope China can be a model for other cities. Coming from New York, which is an old city, I hope that China can learn from New York in terms of being accessible from the ground up in their new cities. And in Shenzhen, a city that only developed in the last few decades, it actually is one of the most accessible cities in China. You go there, you do see wider sidewalks, you do see pedestrian ramps, and it actually won an award for being an accessible city. So I just hope that other cities will want to follow suit. The problem is, as I said, there are so many awards that a city can win, and being an accessible city is just one of them. So I think it needs more prioritization from the government, from the top, to really make sure it's a national priority.
Considering that China is going to be having a massive elderly population, it already has a massive population, but it will be even more in the next decade. Do you think that this should be one of the priorities, because it would determine how much the people who are elderly, who are going to be in hundreds of millions, are going to be able to either explore these cities or will have to just stay at home?
Yes, there is a lot of talk about the 15-minute city in China right now in terms of urban planning. So, a lot of Chinese urban planning to date has been more car-centric. Even Beijing is pretty Soviet-style planning, or in various Chinese cities, they've sort of copied this American car-centric model. But recently, in the past 5 or so years, urban planners are talking about the importance of the 15-minute city. So making sure that someone, particularly someone with disabilities or an elderly person, someone of limited mobility, can access everything they need, the store, their healthcare, etc., within a 15-minute walk. So I think that, even though it's not directly helping people with disabilities, does, because if people can access more things, they can, have a better quality of life. So I think the government should be focusing on it. I mean, there is the Chinese Disabled Persons Federation. So I think China is better off than many other countries because, again, it has these laws, has a Chinese Disabled Persons Federation. It does have a degree of sort of community engagement and activism. I went with an architect to a housing development to analyze the accessibility, and he makes Xiaohongshu social media account posts about different developments, how accessible they are, and people can comment on them. And the government really does sort of have their pulse on what people are saying on social media. So hopefully, with increased awareness and research, the government can prioritize it more and actually provide the funding to local governments to make these changes.
Thank you so much, Martha, for joining us on accessibility in China. The purpose of these conversations is just to make sure that the people who have never been to China, don't know anything about China, get a perspective on different aspects of it. And right now, considering that China has a massive elderly population, a significant population with disabilities, there is even more need to prioritize accessibility and ensuring that the new cities that are developing and the existing cities are more accessible to everyone.